Emily and her 6-month-old son, Noah, should have been safe inside their small apartment, but when authorities arrived, they found Emily calmly smoking on a tattered couch while Noah shivered in a freezing, filthy crib, fighting for his life. What led to this shocking scene, and how could a mother let her baby suffer so completely? The police arrived at the small, dilapidated apartment late in the afternoon, the gray light from the overcast sky casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. A neighbor had reported a foul, lingering smell that had grown unbearable over the past few days, and officers were unsure what they would find behind the peeling paint and rusted metal door. The building itself looked forgotten, with broken windows patched haphazardly with cardboard and curtains hanging in tatters. As the officers stepped inside, the first thing that hit them was the cold. Despite it being early autumn, a thin layer of frost had formed along the window edges, and the air was sharp and biting, seeping through their coats and chilling their bones. The smell was worse than they imagined. It was a mix of rotting food, dampness, and something else they couldn't immediately place. Trash and debris were scattered across the floor, forming narrow, uneven paths between mountains of discarded clothing, broken furniture, and dirty dishes. The faint light filtering through the grimy windows revealed the true extent of neglect. Every surface was coated with a layer of dust and grime, and the walls were streaked with years of unwashed dirt. In the corner of the room, the crib stood like a fragile island in a sea of chaos, its paint chipped and stained. Inside, the baby lay small and still, wrapped loosely in a threadbare blanket, barely protected from the cold that had settled deep into the apartment. Nearby, the mother sat slouched on a torn-out sofa, her fingers holding a cigarette that glowed faintly in the dim light. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, drifting into the icy air and mixing with the oppressive stench. She appeared calm, almost detached, unaware of the full extent of the danger surrounding her child. The officers froze, their training telling them to act quickly, but the scene left them in disbelief. How could someone exist in this state of apathy while a life so small and fragile teetered on the edge of death? The contrast between the mother's casual demeanor and the baby's vulnerability was jarring, the weight of it pressing down on everyone in the room. As they moved closer, the officers could see the signs of suffering etched into the baby's tiny form. The skin was pale, almost gray, and shivering beneath the thin blanket. Small cries had gone unnoticed or unheeded for days, drowned out by the mother's own indifference and the surrounding filth. Every detail spoke of prolonged neglect: empty bottles lying across the floor, half-eaten food discarded carelessly, and the faint traces of mold creeping up the walls. Each step the officers took stirred up dust and debris, a stark reminder of how long the apartment had been left to decay. It was not just the physical filth that shocked them, but the story it told. This was a life ignored, frozen in neglect, where survival was no longer guaranteed. The officers felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and disbelief as they moved through the room, documenting the scene. The realization that a tiny, defenseless child had been living in these conditions, exposed to freezing temperatures and filth, was almost too much to bear. Each detail reinforced the grim truth that they had arrived too late to prevent suffering, and the weight of that truth would linger far beyond the walls of the apartment. The baby's condition was far worse than anyone had initially imagined. Medical personnel rushed in, their expressions tightening as they assessed the infant's fragile body. The child was suffering from severe hypothermia, with tiny limbs trembling uncontrollably and skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. Every breath was shallow, labored, and the faint whimpers that escaped the baby's lips were barely audible over the dull hum of the apartment. The medical team worked quickly to wrap the child in warmed blankets, administering fluids and oxygen, but the damage had already taken its toll. Investigators realized that the baby had endured days, possibly weeks, of extreme neglect, and each passing moment had worsened the fragile state. The apartment itself told a story of despair and hopelessness. Layers of frost clung to the window panes, evidence that the heating had been turned off long ago, likely because bills went unpaid or the mother could not afford the rising cost of keeping the small space warm. The temperature inside the apartment was far below safe levels, yet the mother remained oblivious, smoking quietly on the couch as if the cold and chaos were entirely separate from her life. The environment was more than uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Broken glass glinted faintly from the floor, bottles and cans had been left to rot, and the stench of spoiled food filled every corner, a constant assault on anyone who entered. The apartment was a prison for the child, trapping them in a place meant to provide warmth and safety, yet offering only freezing neglect. Neighbors' accounts began to emerge as investigators pieced together the timeline. Some remembered faint, irregular cries from the apartment, but the sounds were often dismissed as the usual noise of a baby in a crowded building. Others described seeing the mother sitting near the window for hours, smoking, reading, or staring blankly, while the baby's crib remained untouched. Patterns of neglect became clear as investigators compiled these recollections, revealing a household where survival was secondary to the mother's own habits and routines. The baby's suffering had been quiet, almost invisible, masked by the mother's indifference and the decay surrounding them. The investigation also uncovered a more subtle form of malnutrition. The baby had not been fed adequately or consistently, leaving their small frame weakened and vulnerable to illness. Bottles were found scattered across the apartment, some containing remnants of expired formula or milk that had gone sour days before. The combination of cold, filth, and lack of nourishment created a deadly trifecta, each factor amplifying the other. The medical team explained that even if the baby survived the immediate crisis, long-term health effects were almost certain. The neglect had already left a mark, a silent testament to the environment that had replaced care with apathy. The more investigators observed, the clearer it became that this was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a lifestyle, a consistent pattern of disregard that had escalated into life-threatening conditions for the child. The frozen apartment, the piles of trash, the sickly pallor of the baby all pointed to prolonged suffering. Each new detail deepened the sense of urgency and horror. The case was no longer just about a single incident. It was about understanding how neglect could grow unnoticed, hidden behind the thin walls of a small apartment, and how fragile life could be destroyed when the most basic responsibilities were abandoned. The environment and the baby's condition combined to tell a story of slow, cruel deterioration, a reality that weighed heavily on everyone involved. As investigators dug deeper into the mother's past, a troubling pattern began to emerge. She was no stranger to the attention of social services and child welfare agencies. Records revealed multiple instances stretching back years in which her children had been deemed at risk. In some cases, authorities had removed infants temporarily from her care due to unsafe living conditions, only for them to be returned after minimal intervention. Each report described a similar environment: cluttered apartments, unsanitary conditions, inconsistent feeding, and the pervasive presence of cigarette smoke. The more investigators read, the more it became clear that the warning signs had always existed, quietly ignored or underestimated by a system struggling with limited resources and overwhelming caseloads. Court documents painted a picture of a mother who alternated between periods of compliance and neglect. In hearings, social workers often noted that she expressed remorse and promised improvement, but follow-up inspections revealed little had changed. Neighbors and relatives recalled seeing her life unfold in fits and starts, sometimes orderly and attentive, other times chaotic and careless. Each return of a child to her custody came with conditions meant to protect the infant, yet enforcement was inconsistent. The record suggested that the mother's negligence was not accidental, it was a recurring, almost methodical pattern that persisted despite repeated interventions. Investigators also found evidence of deeper struggles in the mother's life. Financial instability, substance use, and mental health challenges had created a cycle she could not break. She lived paycheck to paycheck, relying on public assistance and sporadic help from family members. Despite these hardships, she maintained her smoking habit, often prioritizing it over the most basic needs of her children. Her apartments were typically small and poorly maintained, with inadequate heating and minimal furniture. The living conditions reflected a combination of economic hardship and persistent apathy, a dangerous mixture that left children vulnerable. Interviews with former neighbors and acquaintances added more pieces to the puzzle. Many described her as polite and quiet, someone who never drew attention to herself but whose household always seemed off. Some had glimpsed infants left alone for hours, bottles forgotten and blankets missing, yet no one had suspected the severity of neglect. The mother had learned to conceal the worst aspects of her lifestyle, giving a superficial appearance of normalcy while hiding the reality of a dangerous environment. The contrast between outward appearances and hidden realities made it harder for authorities and neighbors to intervene effectively. The investigative team realized that this case was not an isolated failure. It was the culmination of years of overlooked warning signs, partially enforced regulations, and systemic weaknesses in monitoring at-risk families. Each document, each neighbor's story, and each prior case of intervention built a mosaic of a life defined by inconsistency and disregard for the well-being of children. The tragedy of the baby's suffering was magnified by the knowledge that the danger had always been present, that this was not a sudden catastrophe but the predictable outcome of neglect repeated over time. The history revealed the chilling truth: some patterns, left unchecked, inevitably lead to devastation, and the system designed to protect the most vulnerable sometimes falters under the weight of recurring human frailty. As forensic teams combed through the apartment, they uncovered details that added an unsettling layer of complexity to the case. The initial impression had been one of total neglect, a mother indifferent to her child's suffering, but small, unexpected signs suggested a more complicated story. In the crib, beneath the thin, tattered blanket, there were traces of additional bedding stuffed into corners, as if someone had attempted to insulate the baby from the cold. Tiny toys were scattered nearby, worn and faded, showing that at some point there had been attempts to provide stimulation or comfort. These small efforts contrasted sharply with the overall scene of abandonment, creating a disturbing tension that investigators struggled to reconcile. Medical examinations revealed that the baby had not died instantly. Hypothermia and malnutrition had created a slow decline, and there were faint signs that the child had been fed sporadically. Some bottles contained remnants of formula, though often spoiled or improperly prepared. Investigators speculated that there were moments when the mother had recognized the child's needs and tried to respond, but those attempts were inconsistent, half-hearted, and ultimately insufficient. The reality was grim. The baby had suffered over a prolonged period, enduring discomfort, hunger, and cold, punctuated by brief, ineffective gestures of care. Further inspection uncovered evidence that the mother's actions had been erratic. Cigarette butts littered the apartment, some near the crib, suggesting a disturbing disregard for safety. Yet there were also items indicating a contradictory awareness of danger: folded blankets, makeshift barriers, and attempts to shield the child from the cold draft through the window. The forensic team concluded that her behavior reflected a conflicted state of mind. She was aware enough to attempt minimal protection, but unable or unwilling to follow through consistently. The duality of neglect and fleeting concern complicated the narrative, making the case not just one of apathy but of sporadic, unstable caregiving. The discovery raised troubling questions. Was the mother capable of care under different circumstances, or were these small gestures merely surface-level acts that masked a deeper inability to prioritize her child's well-being? Social workers and psychologists consulted on the case suggested that this pattern was not uncommon in severe neglect. Caregivers sometimes act out of habit, guilt, or momentary impulse, creating intermittent signs of concern that confuse observers and authorities alike. These conflicting behaviors delayed intervention in the past, allowing the neglect to escalate to life-threatening levels. Investigators pieced together a timeline that revealed the slow, tragic trajectory of the baby's suffering. Days and weeks of cold and hunger eroded the child's strength, punctuated by sporadic attempts at feeding and warmth that were too little, too late. The apartment, once merely filthy and unsafe, became a portrait of a mind caught between awareness and indifference. Every item, every discarded bottle, every shivering breath of the baby told a story of conflict and contradiction, of fleeting moments of care that could not counterbalance a sustained environment of neglect. The revelation that someone had tried, in small, insufficient ways, only intensified the horror, emphasizing the fragile line between intention and action, awareness and inaction, life and death. The mother's arrest marked the beginning of a long, painful process of accountability and reflection. She was charged with child endangerment and neglect resulting in death, and as the legal proceedings unfolded, the full extent of the tragedy became evident. Court hearings presented a harrowing picture of the apartment, the baby's condition, and the mother's history of neglect. Medical reports and expert testimony detailed how prolonged exposure to cold, malnutrition, and filth had irreparably harmed the infant. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the trial also highlighted uncomfortable questions about systemic failures and the ways warning signs had gone unheeded for years. As the case moved through the legal system, it drew attention to the broader community. Neighbors and social workers were called to testify, sharing observations that painted a stark contrast between the mother's public appearance and the hidden reality of her home. Some described subtle warning signs they had noticed but dismissed, while others acknowledged moments when they suspected neglect but felt powerless to intervene effectively. The cumulative testimony revealed a pattern of missed opportunities, each one contributing to the tragic outcome. It became clear that the baby's death was not simply the result of one individual's actions, but also the failure of multiple systems meant to protect the most vulnerable. During the trial, psychological evaluations of the mother offered further insight into her behavior. Experts suggested a mix of mental health struggles, chronic stress, and learned patterns of neglect. She had grown accustomed to managing life in survival mode, prioritizing her own immediate comforts over the needs of others. Yet the small signs of care found in the apartment indicated that she was not entirely incapable of concern. Her actions had been inconsistent, fluctuating between neglect and fleeting attempts to provide for the child. This duality underscored a chilling reality. Even those who show moments of care can create environments that are ultimately unsafe when neglect persists. The trial concluded with a conviction, and the mother was sentenced to a term that reflected the severity of her actions and the preventable nature of the baby's suffering. While the verdict provided some measure of justice, it could not erase the profound loss. Families and social service organizations in the community used the case as a catalyst for change, advocating for stronger monitoring of at-risk households, increased resources for child protection, and more robust support for struggling parents. The baby's story became a symbol, a reminder of how quickly life can be threatened when basic care is absent and warning signs are ignored. In the months following the trial, the apartment was cleared and sanitized, transformed from a place of decay into a site of hope. Community organizations worked to turn the space into a safe environment for families in need, using the tragedy as a lesson in vigilance, compassion, and responsibility. The baby's memory lingered, a somber reminder of lives that can be lost to neglect, but also a motivation for change. Authorities, social workers, and neighbors were left to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that protection requires constant effort, awareness, and accountability. The story of the frozen apartment, the struggling mother, and the tiny child who suffered became a cautionary tale, one that would resonate far beyond the walls where it all took place, urging society to recognize and act on the signs of danger before it is too late.